Hello and welcome to Chapter 1. We're going to be taking a look today at just some basic payroll and personnel records and the need to be compliant and why that's so important and what laws are involved with that. So the basic objectives here, again, looking at laws, examining what we need to do as far as record keeping, and looking at some of the processes and procedures in an HR department. We're also going to look at personnel records and have our first peek at a payroll register and employee earnings records. So basically the first little ditty here in the book is about the payroll profession. And again, this seems like such a drab identification. What do you do for a living? Process payroll. But it's really actually gotten a lot more, in my opinion. Of course, I'm an accountant, so my idea of excitement might be very different from yours. But it's gotten a lot more interesting because there's so many issues surrounding, diversity and Obamacare and the Family Medical Leave Act. And there's just been some, kind of controversial, and there's a real social justice element to a lot of these laws that really can make payroll actually a pretty interesting profession. As the responsibilities are increasing, we're seeing that on a national level that folks that are running payroll departments are making between $42,500 and $57,700. So, that's a pretty decent living. There's a way to become certified through the American Payroll Association. And there's also a code of ethics that's set forth. As you can imagine, when you're dealing with all that confidential data, it's really, really important that you're very much understand the need for discretion. So there's tons of laws that impact payroll, federal, state, county, even international laws, actually, when we start talking about working and living in other countries but remaining a U.S. citizen. So these aren't really going to go into a lot of depth today, but I just want to kind of give you an overview. We're going to talk about a lot of them in more detail later. The first one is the Fair Labor Standards Act. How many of y'all have heard of that? One person. Okay, this is basically everything that mandates minimum wage, overtime, no child labor allowed in this country. It sets the provisions for when you can be exempt from overtime or not. So it's really, really an important law. It was passed a long time ago, in the 30s. Who was president in 1938? New Deal. Who wrote the New Deal? Franklin D. Roosevelt. Right? So part of the New Deal was prior to the New Deal, there was no such thing as minimum wage or overtime. If I wanted to work you 80 hours a week and pay you 12 cents an hour and you were willing to do it, I could do that, right? And he said there's no way we're ever going to raise the standard of living in this country until we get people on an equitable pay scale, okay? So that was the basis of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Also, and this was, honestly, Obamacare has been compared to the Federal Insurance Contribution Act, also part of the New Deal, also Franklin D. Roosevelt. It was really the last major social and taxation piece of overhaul legislation this country has seen prior to Obamacare. Does anybody know what we call this? I mean, in our just day-to-day language? Huh? We call it, FICA is the acronym, but it's Social Security. And this is our Social Security system. Prior to 1938, there was no Social Security. There was no Medicare. There was no protection if your partner dropped dead. Most often at that point in time, obviously, your husband dropped dead if you were a woman. And you had 7 kids, which wouldn't have been unusual then. Boy, that sucked for you. There was no social nets whatsoever. So that was another thing FDR said, is that we have to have some sort of safety nets in social programs for retirees, disabled folks, folks that have lost their partner that's the earner, and that's FICA. Income tax withholding laws. Income tax withholding laws, or income tax in general, was passed as the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, giving the internal, or the federal government essentially through the Internal Revenue Service, the right to administer and collect taxes and to penalize citizens if they don't pay taxes. And of course we have those not only at the federal level, but I think 42 states have state income tax, and then a lot of localities too. We don't have a local tax in Missoula. It's not really a rural state thing, but you know, like Dallas has one, San Jose has one, Brooklyn has one, some of the Chicago suburbs have them. So that's an income tax at the local level. Also the Unemployment Tax Acts, again, part of the New Deal. Another safety net, saying if you become employed through no fault of your own, do you just become destitute and live out on the streets? Well, if you've ever traveled in second or third world countries, that's exactly what happens in most other places. But in America, you actually can turn to unemployment compensation, can't you? And get benefits to tide you over while you look for another job. And most of these up here, most of us don't even think about. It's just like, oh yeah, that's how it rolls here. But they are incredible, incredible privileges. And most of them are like 60 to 70 years old. So well, a lot of you are pretty young. So say your great-grandparents or maybe even grandparents certainly had none of these social nets. My grandparents certainly didn't. Fair employment laws, yet another one, right? Anti-discrimination, making it against the law for me to actively discriminate based on the tenets of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right? And that's pretty recent. Who was president in 1964? Who signed the Civil Rights Act? Anybody see Selma? Everybody's seen Star Wars and nobody saw Selma. Lyndon B. Johnson. Kennedy wrote it and was killed, and Johnson actually put his pen to it. But prior to 1964, it was perfectly legal in this country to discriminate against race, ethnicity, gender, age, anything, color, and then there's tons of other federal laws. Okay, a little bit more detail. Fair Labor Standards Act, again, passed in 1938. First minimum wage, I think, was 13 cents an hour. Now federal minimum wage is $7.25, although did that change in 2016? Is it $7.95 now? Oh. Higher than this or higher than $7.95?
Higher than $7.95. I thought it was like $8.25.
Is it? I'll have to look that up. That's probably something I should know teaching people. The thing is, Montana's has been higher than federal, so you have to pay whichever is higher. So, for example, if you're in a state that has a minimum wage under federal law, you have to pay federal law. If you're in a state like Montana that's got a minimum wage higher than federal law, then you have to pay the higher one. At any rate, so that's minimum wage laws. Equal pay for equal work, right? So this is essentially a gender equity issue. And so are we there? Do we have equal pay for equal work in America? Some people are shaking their head no. What do you think? Have you heard any stats on it? Do women make what men make for equivalent jobs?
They work hard enough for it.
They don't. We make about 82 cents on the dollar. Now, economists that are on a certain side of the political spectrum will point out that the reason that women don't make dollar for dollar what men do is because we have a more sporadic work history, because statistically we're the ones that have a tendency to drop out of the workforce to parent, and stay home with the kids, so that impacts our long range earning. But there have been, like Walmart is an easy recent example, where there's just, flat out examples of management, similar scaled managers from different, from the two genders making different amounts. So that violates, you're in big trouble if you get busted for that, because you're violating federal law, right? It's not just some little hokey Missoula law. You're violating the Fair Labor Standards Act, and the penalties are very, very significant. This last bullet's important too. It requires that payroll records are maintained, and that doesn't sound, very sexy or important, but it's really important because prior to the FLSA, if I had a beef with my employer, like, oh gosh, I feel like, I recorded 52 hours of work last week and you only paid me for 46, they could just say, oh, well, we've already shredded the records, or we don't have records. Now the FLSA puts the burden of proof on the employer, so they've got to hold on to their payroll records for 7 years. So you've got recompense, you've got the ability to go back. And I've, one of the, sort of rewarding things about teaching this class is I've seen a number of students over the years say, oh my gosh, what was happening to me in the workplace wasn't right or wasn't equitable or wasn't legal. And I've helped to get them in touch with folks, and they've been able to go back and actually get, recompense for, basically what was wrong. So FICA is kind of interesting. Again, this is the name of the act, Federal Insurance Contribution Act. And what it says is a lot of things, but what's important to us in here is that it imposes 2 taxes. Social Security and Medicare. But that's not actually, those aren't actually their real names. Those are kind of the nicknames that most of us call them. What they're really called is OASDI and HI. Old Age and Survivors Disability Insurance. That's the acronym. Old Age, Survivors, i.e., I've never worked, my husband was the earner, he dies, I have children under 18, I'm going to get benefits, aren't I, as a survivor. Disability, if you know anybody on long-term federal disability, this is the program that it comes through. Insurance. So OASDI, it's what you and I call Social Security. HI is health insurance for indigent people as well as folks that are on Social Security, so older folks or survivors or disabled people. And you've probably heard a lot of scuttlebutt about Medicare expanding under Obamacare, right, to expand it and make it more accessible to a greater portion of the population. So that's a very controversial piece around HI right now. Anybody have any idea how much of your paycheck you put into these 2 taxes? Roughly? Guess. I assume you've all had a paycheck. Even if you pay no income tax, what do they take out? This. So say you make, how much? Okay, 10 cents on the dollar. Anybody else have a guess? 7.65. So you were close. 7.65. The interesting thing about it is, it's matched by your employer. So it really becomes 15.3 cents on the dollar. You pay half of it, and your employer matches it out of his or her pocket. This is a huge program, obviously, right? Huge amounts of money. Right now it's in a surplus, and when you hear the astronomical amounts of federal debt that we have, one of the things that doesn't even really do justice as to how bad our debt really is the fact that the Social Security Fund is liquid and makes it look less than what it really is. So income tax, how do you guys pay your income tax? Do you pay it all at the end of the year? Yeah, you have it withheld. Most of us have it withheld. And we'll take a look at the laws surrounding that. For most of us, we couldn't write a check for our income tax bill at the end of the year, right? Because we would have spent the money. So as we go, we withhold our state and federal income tax, and then really the only reason we file a tax return is to do what? Kind of like get even. Huh? Get money back. I wish that happened. It's to kind of get even, right? They either owe you or we owe them. Right? And so that's really what the tax return is all about. Taxes for states are different in each state. We have, I think ours is the 16th highest in the country, so we're about in the middle of the pack. Some states don't have income tax at all, like Washington, Texas, Delaware, Hawaii, but they have really high either sales tax or property taxes. So, I mean, state's got to have some way to collect funds from its citizens. It just depends on what policies you think work best. There's 2 unemployment tax acts, FUTA and SUTA. FUTA is used, is submitted to the federal government, to the IRS, and it's used to pay like the umbrella organization that is kind of big brother to all of the state unemployment agencies. So in other words, FUTA doesn't actually pay unemployment benefits. It pays the federal agency to make sure that all the states are doing what they're supposed to do. So each state is required to have an unemployment agency. In Montana, does anyone know what ours is called? Who do you apply to if you want unemployment benefits? In Montana, it's called the Department of Labor and Industry, and they're in Helena. And they have different laws here than they do in, Wyoming or Idaho. We have different rates, we have different caps, you get different amount of benefits depending upon what state you work in. So each state has to mandatorily have unemployment insurance, but they all look different. And so if I'm and by the way, these are only paid by the employer. In other words, these don't come out of your paychecks, do they? Only the employer writes a check for these taxes. And if they're not current on them, I mean, their business will get shut down. And I mean, like that. Same with workers' comp. If you're not current on your workers' comp premiums, that is grounds to have your business yellow taped and lockboxed and shut down. So also another pretty important reason to know what's going on in payroll if you're going to own or manage a business. So SUTA is where the actual unemployment benefits come from. Fair employment. Civil Rights Act of 1964, EEO, is also another term to describe the Civil Rights Act. And basically there were 5 tenets that you couldn't discriminate based on color, race, religion, national origin, or gender. And we'll see as we kind of go through this that a couple things were left out of this description. Can you see any categories of discrimination that are overtly missing here? Sexual orientation, of course, this is 1964. That wasn't even something that was actually overtly discussed, was it? What else do you see in here that's missing? Age, ageism. And that is something that I can't say I really thought a whole bunch about until I crossed the magic barrier into getting my art magazine. And it's really quite a big deal. So we have a whole act that prevents discriminating against people based on age as well. And then I'll talk about the sexual orientation in just a moment. That battle is being fought state by state rather than from a federal perspective.
They don't have the disability ones in there too.
Oh, very good. Thank you. I completely forgot about that. And that didn't come about until the 90s. So that was 30 years later that disabled folks got access to anti-discrimination legislation. Yeah, thank you. That's glaringly missing here. Okay, so fair employment, it applies to companies. So let me just, before I go into the details of this, let me just say something. You'll see a lot of these laws, federal laws, will say things like, only applies to companies with 50 or more employees, or only applies to companies with 10 or more employees, or, has to pay X amount of wages for 20 weeks out of the year. Whenever you see all of those wordings in big pieces of legislation, that is the result of our bill, making a legislative bill process. In other words, it's all the compromise that goes into making those bills. So here you can see it only applies, fair employment only applies if you have 15 or more workers. So does that mean if you're a little shop, I own Board of Missoula and I've got, 6 snowboard and skateboard dudes working for me, that I can discriminate? Well, I can tell you this law doesn't apply to me. Fair Labor Standards Act doesn't apply to me. Or Civil Rights Act doesn't apply to me. Now we're talking, are there state laws that don't have size of business? So you've got to be really careful when you feel like you're on legal grounds for something. You've got to always dig into the law and say, well, how many employees do you have to comply with this? Because in Montana or Missoula, I can say probably 80% of our businesses have less than 20 employees, don't they? I mean, they're almost all small businesses. Then in 1991, a kind of a second, V2 or version 2 of the Civil Rights Act was passed, which can require very significant, very stringent punitive damages, which means if you intentionally discriminated, I can come after you with punitive damages, meaning to punish you. In other words, not just to get even with the people you've hurt, but actually as a punitive or a punishment situation. ADEA came on board, so Civil Rights Act was 64. This was 68, I believe. And our outgoing president in 68 was who? Johnson, right? And who came in? Nixon? Maybe we'll have a little quiz on Thursday just to do like presidents from the last 50 years. You don't need to come up with like the whole 220-year history. I mean, of course, most of you probably weren't born until the 90s. Can you recite the presidents from the 90s forward? Okay, that's all good. I'll just keep hammering it home. ADEA, 1968, Johnson was president, heels of the Civil Rights Act, and basically it says exactly the same thing as the Civil Rights Act. Oh, and I didn't actually make a point of these three words, but basically instead of just having this vague discrimination, it's you can't discriminate in who you hire, you can't discriminate in who you fire, you can't discriminate in who you promote, and there should be one more word up there, which is compensating. So those are very specifically the things you can't discriminate, in doing. And this applies to employers with 20 or more employees. It provides protection, and really the ageism now starts at 40 years old, which doesn't really feel that old. But there's some really key exceptions, like if age, like for pilots or railroad engineers or people that need to have very sharp, eyesight and hearing and reactionary time. So that's obvious. You can say, after 52, you can't be a pilot or whatever. So ADA, 1994. Gold Star. You guys were all born then. Who was president? I'll give you a hint. His wife is thinking about or is making a run for the presidency. Clinton. Bush's wife is thinking about running? Anything's possible in this race. Did you guys see where Bloomberg just threw his hat in the ring? The old mayor in New York City with an individual net worth of like $500 million. This could arguably be the most interesting election cycle ever. Crazy, crazy. So Clinton was president in 1994, and basically this was a result of a really strong lobby on behalf of disabled folks, which was sort of a new thing in the 80s forward. As a group, I don't think had really found their voice, their political voice and their activist voice, but they have, and they do. So basically this, you can't discriminate in hiring, firing, promoting, or compensating based upon a person's disability. The problem with this law isn't the first bullet. It was the second bullet. It says I have to make reasonable accommodation, right, for somebody's disability in the workplace. So what does that mean to you? So what if I got in a car accident and I was in a wheelchair? Should they reasonably accommodate me here? Sure. Probably could do that with pretty minimal expense, right? What if I was in, I got some sort of disease and I lost my eyesight? Should they accommodate me as a professor? What would they have to do to accommodate me without my sight? I'd have to be shadowed by somebody, wouldn't I? I mean, I don't honestly even know the answer to that, but I would assume, or expensive software. So is that reasonable? Well, gosh, I've been here 23 years. I'm at the back end of my career. It's a pretty big institution. Versus I'm a little mom and pop optical shop. And now one of my opticians has lost her eyesight. Is that reasonable accommodation? You see where I'm going? Size of the institution, cash flow of the institution or the company, length of service by the person versus brand new applicant. I dealt with it before we moved back to Montana. We were living in northern Colorado in the late 80s, and I was controller of a biotechnology firm. And we had a lot of microbiologists, and their stations were all stand-up stations because they worked under these hoods and, you know, with a lot of assays and plates and what have you. And we had a really qualified applicant come in a wheelchair, and what that would have required was building ramps so that she could get up to the stations. Okay, so was that reasonable? And we were doing about $7 million a year in gross sales. So is that reasonable accommodation? You're shaking your head, sure.
That's not how bad you want to be an employee.
I'm not talking about how bad I want the employee. I'm talking about complying with the law. Could she demand reasonable accommodation? So we build those ramps. How do my other, quote unquote, able-bodied folks get to the workstations now? Right? So they've got to be mobile. So now you're kind of redesigning your lab. I'm not saying there's an answer. There's not a right or wrong answer. I'm posing the questions. And that's why this particular law, because of these two words, this thing has been, it's 25 years old now, 22 years old, it has been held up in courts. And it's a pretty, it's a very valiant thing and an ethical and moral piece of legislation that we all believe in, but it's really, really hard to administer in real life. Okay, this is a mouthful. Federal Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. Passed in 1993. Bill Clinton was president. And most of us would know its nickname, like a lot of pieces of law, like, Obamacare is the nickname. Its nickname is welfare reform. And many of you probably are too young to remember this, but prior to this welfare reform piece of legislation, which is a gigantic, something like 1,700-page law, there were not as many controls or requirements for folks that were lifetime welfare recipients. And the goal of this piece of legislation was to eradicate cultural and generational dependence on welfare, right? So it's not, that's not your job. So what we have to do, it's a giant piece of legislation, but how it impacts payroll specifically is one of the things this law does is kind of digs into why people are poor and dependent upon welfare generationally. And one of the things that came out, which is no shock, is that single parent families are more likely to be impoverished than when you've got both parents. And one of the big issues there is the fact that absent parents don't pay child support on a timely basis, and that adds to the impoverishment. So what this does and how it impacts payroll is when you hire somebody now, you've got 20 days as the payroll manager or processor or owner of the business to get the information about your new hire to something called, is that up here? Yeah, OCSE, the Office of Child Support Enforcement. And what that means is that, so say Amber comes to work for me, and I fill out the new hire reporting form. I write her wage, her address, her social security number, and in the old days, I would just send that to Helena. And it would go into the magic database, and if she was behind on her child support payments because her ex-spouse had their kids, she would get, what would she get? Do you know? What would happen to her if she was behind on her child support and they caught up with her? Yeah, they'd lien her wages, wouldn't they? Put a lien on her wages. So what she did is like, I don't want to pay stinking child support. All she would have to do is leave Montana. Right? Once you cross state lines, there was no cross-check. This gets around that. It all goes through a big database, a federal database, so that no matter where she goes, if she goes to work and this new hire reporting form, she could owe money in Maryland and get a job, working at the depot in downtown Missoula, and it's going to come up within 20 days and her wages are going to be garnished and get that child support back to Maryland. So this has been a huge poverty alleviation technique. And again, this is a very small piece of a big law, but it's the piece that we have to be cognizant of in payroll. And the name of it, I think that I got it up there. It's called a new hire reporting form. And you have to send it to Helena, and then they punch it into the federal database.
What's garnished? Like, can they take most of your paycheck?
It's different in every state. Here's the problem. In Montana, it's astronomical. They can take up to 60% of your wages. What's the problem with that? So, argue the pros and cons. Let's say you owe money. You owe $5,000.
To work, you give incentive to do something like under the table where you're not having to deal with.
If I take so much of your wages, obviously you're intentionally not paying your child support. That's not true. There's situations where you can't. But say you're just not, and your kids are in Florida and you're up here, okay? If I take so much of your wages, just what you said, you think you're going to show back up for work the next day after you collect that first paycheck? They're like, heck no, I'm going to go under the table, which is where we think about 20% of our workforce is. They don't have bank accounts. They don't have W-2s. They don't file tax returns. They are not compliant in any way in our, commercially above ground culture. Huh? I have really mixed feelings about that. I have people every year that will surface in my tax practice and say, call me, and they're almost always tradespeople. I drywall, I'm a carpenter, or like, I buy and sell some cars, and then I also, grow some agricultural products that are legal from a medicinal standpoint, and now I want to get legal. And so my first question is, have you ever filed a tax return, or when's your last tax return? I've never filed a tax return, And they're trying to get legal because they want to do something like, eventually buy a house, or they want to get into the healthcare system, and they, obviously can't without coming up above board. So, I guess I kind of believe in helping people that are trying to make that transition, become, part of, citizenry, so to speak. With that said, I will always get my cash up front to do their tax return. So that's that. IRCA is the Immigration Reform and Control Act. This was 1987. 87, which was at the very end of Reagan's tenure. And this was, in my memory, about when there started to be national attention paid to the number of immigrants that were working in the southern part of the United States, early to mid-'80s. So this was 87. And basically this was, for most of you, your whole life, anytime you've gone for a job, you've had to fill out an I-9. But that's only been really the last, 28 years, 27 years. So basically what it is, well, it's a law that bars hiring and retaining aliens. And really prior to 1987, it wasn't illegal to do that. Okay? So it's really, again, this is a pretty new law in the whole history of the country. And the way that we affect that is that when you go to work, what do you have to show to fill out that I-9? I think you need 2 forms, don't you?
Passport or Social Security and driver's license.
So if you have a passport, that's the only document. Otherwise, you have to show 2. Yeah. How many of you have passports? 2, 3 people? Penalties are really high. Criminal penalties are in addition to civil. And also, this isn't required of an employer, but there's a new system called E-Verify. So not so much a Montana problem, but in lots of states, identities are bought and sold like, 6 packs of Corona on the corner. And there's a lot of concern with employers that they've got a whole host of people working for them that aren't who they say they are. In fact, they're undocumented. So if I'm an employer that's concerned about that, I can go into this E-Verify system and do some cross-checking myself. But it's not required that I do that. It's more for peace of mind. Okay. Family, I don't think that clock's right, and I don't have mine up. Can someone tell me? 1:50. So it's about 7 minutes slow. Thanks. We'll go through one more act and call it a day. Family Medical Leave Act. This is I would say arguably a pretty pivotal piece of legislation. Again, 1993, Clinton. And it applies to companies with 50 or more people. So again, you can see it's not for small businesses per se. But what it does is really, really huge in my mind, which is it guarantees that if you've got a deal with any of these things, I've got a sick parent, a sick kid, a sick spouse, I'm giving birth or I'm adopting, or I'm in healthcare crisis, I'm guaranteed my job back after 12 weeks. You've got to give me 12 weeks of unpaid leave. Now, it doesn't need to be used all at once. So there's some really interesting ramifications about this law. Has anybody here had any exposure to this or used it or known anybody that's used it? Do you want to share the situation or?
Mine was just medical leave. I was out for like 8 weeks.
And they had to preserve your job.
Not only preserve it, but I actually got partial pay too.
That was out of their own beneficence. Yeah. They didn't need to do that. The way that, did you hear what she said? She said she was partially paid for it. The way this law was originally proposed was paid leave. And you can imagine the lobby, all the, the business lobbies that said, oh, it's just going to put us out of business. Well, we're going to put them out of business. But this is an example of how a piece of law goes into a subcommittee and then it's bandied about and crafted and vetted until it comes out something everybody can live with. There's one of the presidential candidates, Bernie Sanders, is saying this is one of his primary tenets is that he believes that everybody should have up to 6 months paid leave for these issues. Scandinavia, I lived in Denmark for 2 years. You have a baby, you get a year paid off. Right? And their whole premise being, granted, it's a socialist country, but their whole premise being is that you pay now to give the maternal caregiver or paternal caregiver that you're off with their child, or you pay later as a society because the child didn't have proper nurturing. So they're huge believers in preventative social policy rather than like building more prisons and more social workers and more clinics for people that are a product of things that went wrong that could have been fixed at the beginning. So this has lots of interesting ramifications. This was passed in '93. I came here in 94, and literally worked in this job for 10 weeks and got the news that my father was dying of lymphoma, and really essentially, I mean, I had to leave and go be with him and sell his house and get him to his caregivers and blah, 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 blah. I mean, basically, they just had to do that. And they had to leave my job open for me. If that had happened a year earlier, this dream job that, I mean, for my whole life I would have gotten, and then I would have basically been let go of or had to make the choice whether to go to my dad or not. So it's I mean, that's just kind of my little personal story. And I mean, many people have stories around FMLA that it really kind of saved their back ends. The downside to it from an employer standpoint, in my opinion, because I've seen this, I work with a lot of employers, is that because it doesn't need to be used at once, 12 weeks times 5 days is 60 days a year, right? So that's more than a work day a week, isn't it? That's more than a work day a week. So I'm an employer, this is a real life example, and I've got somebody with an addiction issue, which is classified as a disease by the AMA, and she doesn't come to work ever on Mondays. Health issue, right? Or struggling with mental health issues, but she's not there a day a week. And I'm running, a print shop or an accounting department or something that's got things that need to get out every single week. Who's going to do that work? But she's protected under FMLA. So, I mean, that might sound like an extreme example, but there are situations where I think it's tough for the employer, even though I really believe that it's a great law from, a social standpoint.
And it resets every 12-month period?
It does. It does. Comments on this or questions? Have you guys heard of this law? Additionally, the health care coverage for the employee must be maintained. You've got the right to come back to the same job or a comparable position, and it expands to 26 weeks if you've got somebody that's in the injured or ill in the line of duty. And some states, like very progressive states like California and Delaware, actually have paid family leave requirements. What's the downside of doing that? I mean, I think we can all say, there's a huge upside to it, but what's the downside? Like in California, as an employer, you're required to give paid leave. What's the potential downside to that? Right, is you have
them, so you're paying like double wage.
You are paying double wage. And so there's always this balance, isn't this, between in these kinds of policies where we want to be societally helpful, but neither do we want to put so many regulations and so many burdens on small businesses that they can't operate. One of the main reasons that people are below, many people are below ground is because to operate as a small business, by the time you're paying your workers' comp and your food and your suit and your matching FICA, and if you're in a state like this where you've also got, these kinds of things, people just can't, they just can't make it. It just doesn't pencil out. And so you've got to be very careful when you're setting policies and laws that you're not losing people that want to be compliant because it's too onerous. Okay, with that said, I'm going to call it a day.